On the other slides, I'm going to talk for a bit and then ask Clarissa some questions. But on this one, I'm just going to read it off and turn it over to Clarissa because she's become such an expert in this. So socialize before you organize. Organizing is about building community. The first thing you need to learn to organize is a social gathering. Food, drinks, and a good time are a great way to build trust, camaraderie, and boost morale. Intentionally socializing outside of work allows you to get to know your coworkers and hear about things they care about. Take notes later on, not during the social, because that'll look weird and not very social or fun or friendly. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Clarissa to talk about how she's approached this successfully.
All right, hi, my name is Clarissa. I currently work at it's outside Chicago. I've been there 2 years. And yeah, like Dawn and mentioned that I kind of specialize with the socializing aspect, just kind of getting everybody to meet outside of work. But obviously a lot happens during work hours, just kind of speaking amongst each other and just getting to know each other really is a big part of it during work hours, I would say. Just kind of building that trust, building that relationship in order to get people to go out with you. But yeah, like it says, food, drinks. I started out with just a couple people, a couple of friends, coworkers for coffee before work, for brunch before work. And then once you get to know people's birthdays or people, they transition into other jobs, or that's kind of when you kind of use that as an excuse to go out to drink. Hey, there's this bar nearby that I've been to that I really like, or there's this restaurant that's open late. Of course, my experience is more so with late night shifts. So that's really where the specialty is.
And Clarissa, I would ask you too, if you could talk briefly about how people in those meetings, like how do you talk about work in those meetings? Do you approach it like real aggressively, or do you start real soft?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Do you start real soft and build towards stuff in the socials, or do you just come at them?
I think it's really easy to kind of even just go for the leap of asking people out after work, or even to a small restaurant before work, to coffee before work, just because, people need coffee, and also people want to, let loose after a long shift. So it's not as difficult as you would think to get a group of people out. What I've also heard that other stores are doing is game night, or if there's karaoke nearby, or, like they invite people over to an apartment. We've had success with that also, for birthdays, or with the turnover being so high. It's like, oh, it's my last day. Does anyone want to do something? And I usually like to kind of gather people in the break room, or let everyone know via mass text, nothing suspicious in the text, just like, hey, it's this person's last day, does anyone, we're heading here at this time. And you get a good crowd, and so it builds.
Okay, great, thank you. And I do want to say very quickly that I like Clarissa's approach of like getting drinks after work if you can do it, over like a game night, because a game night in somebody's house seems more selective, and like people who don't feel real comfortable with you might not want to go to that. Whereas drinks after a bar, it feels more impersonal and you can escape, right? So I feel like more people do that than would say go to somebody's house. Okay, great, thanks. Next slide then. So now we're going to go over the organizing conversation, and there's sort of an art and a science to the organizing conversation. The science is that organizers over the last several decades have figured out what works, and so they do this now over and over. The art of it is bringing yourself to it, being an individual, just being natural and reacting, in the ways that you would. So the introduction the first part, who you are and what your concerns are. So that could look different at different phases of organizing. If you're approaching somebody who's just come into the store and you're kind of just trying to assess people, you're going to be real, like just introducing yourself as like a friendly kind of way, and you're not really going to talk about work too much. You're just going to be trying to get to know them. If it's later on and say you're having a union drive and a card drop, you're going to actually tell them, hey, I'm so-and-so, and I'm here to ask you to sign a union card, and then you're going to go right into it. So it can happen differently in different phases. Get the issues. So what does your coworker care about? This is super critical because this is why they're going to want to get involved. Nobody gets involved. I shouldn't say nobody. Very few people get involved for like large abstract reasons. Most people get involved because there are things that they care about. And so if you want to get them to be on or sign a union card or whatever it is that you're asking somebody to do at that point in time, you really need to be asking them questions that get at what they care about, and then use that as the hook to bring them in. And I like to always point out that any issue is something a union can address, or almost any issue is something a union can address. Wages, union. Sexual harassment, union. Like organizers or workers can organize around just about any issue. So help them understand how that's connected to what you're doing, and then bring them in. Agitation. So why is this unfair? So you have to help people get worked up. And this is really important because people are used to things being unfair, right? We talk about it all the time, all the things that are unfair, and we kind of accept it. And we're like, oh, we can't really change it. We like to complain about it without doing things about it. So here you're helping them feel the unfairness of the issue that they just shared with you. And you're agreeing that it's unfair, and you're getting them worked up, and maybe ideally in a perfect scenario, also connecting it to another worker's issue. So, oh yeah, Cam over here feels the exact same way that you do. Cam and produce feel the exact same way. They told me, XYZ. And so help them see that they're also, not only is it unfair, but it's also connected to other people, and that other people are upset about this. Then the plan to win. So this is what we often call the give hope phase, because people don't want to get involved unless they think that there's actually something that can be done about it. So this is where you talk about the vision of your group. What is it that you plan on doing? Why is it that working together collectively, taking action together collectively is the solution? Why will that do something? So, hey, we're organizing around X thing, we're getting people together to get the boss to do Y thing in response to that issue. And then helping them understand that it's going to be effective and why. So, for instance, if you're organizing a union, explaining that unionized workers' wages are way higher than non-unionized workers, things that can give them hope are very helpful when talking about why this is going to work. And then inoculation. So this means basically preparing them. We have here preparing them for the boss's response. It could also be coworkers' responses that are negative, but in general, we're often talking about the boss. So in other words, in terms of the virus that we're all, currently dealing with in the pandemic, they give you a little shot of it to build your immunity to the larger sickness. That's what inoculation is. It's kind of giving them a taste of what's to come, of the bad stuff, in order so that they can weather it. And it might not seem important, but it's absolutely critical, because if you're in a union drive, for instance, and the boss starts like harassing people, bringing them into one-on-one meetings, yelling at them, doing all of these things, making them cry, like people are going to be unprepared for that if they don't know what's going to happen, and they're going to freak out, and they're not going to want to go forward with the union drive. But if they're prepared for it, if you've talked about it, role played it, then they're like, oh, I know what this is. This is just another one of the boss's tricks, and then they can get through it. And then call the question. So ask them to take action. This is the last part, and it comes in play in certain phases. So, when you're just getting to know people early on, it's not yet the time for that. But later on, if it's somebody that you trust, then you might be asking them to be on the organizing committee. If it is somebody who, you think will take an action, then it's asking them to take an action. If it's the card drive time, then it's asking them to sign the card. So all of these things that you're going through throughout the conversation are meant to arrive at this final result. But I will say also, if they don't have to happen in this order, and they don't all have to happen, and that you should never try to memorize them and just spit them out in a conversation. Like you shouldn't try to just like robotically try and go through all these in your head, that it's more about, you know, trying to orient yourself before you go have a conversation. Some of this will stick with you in the moment. And I always tell people, if like 2 things of this wind up being helpful to you, then this is helpful. So just don't get overly stuck on like, I have to go through all these things in every conversation or in this order, because that's not the case. Again, being natural is super important, being a person, being human, and connecting with others. So now I'm gonna ask Clarissa. Clarissa, are there some questions that you've asked workers that were successful in getting at their issues? Like, what are the kinds of things you do to get people talking?
I guess one of the things that I like to bring up a lot is like, oh, hey, like, do you have a favorite supervisor? Or do you have a supervisor that you don't get along with? And then that really leads the conversation into why they have issues, and it's usually issues of, you know, favoritism or just unfairness. So that's really a great segue into, you know, well, why do you feel that way? And I've also had success just, you know, talking about how are your interactions with customers, you know, have you ever had something happen? And it doesn't seem as natural, but, you know, you're at work and you can kind of ask, like, what section do you like working the best, and why, you know, or, you know, what shift do you prefer? We recently had a new captain come in, new supervisors, so we always talk about that kind of thing. How are you getting along? I guess the turnover too is a good topic, just people coming and going and why they think that is and how they feel about it. And but, you know, I also like to talk about, get to know their personal life a little bit too, like whether they have family, whether they're a student, if they work another job, you know, things that they deal with outside of work that, you know, do affect them at work. And I've found those to be successful segues into, well, you know, what do you think would be a fair wage, or what do you think of the benefits we're getting, or did you hear that they're slashing the contribution to the retirement? And, you know, just different things. They always play into what's going on outside of work, and that's what I've had success with.
Identifying issues. So learn about your coworkers as people, including finding out what workplace issues they care about. We talked about how to do that in the one-on-one. And a good rule of thumb is to try to listen more than you talk. This is particularly helpful because you don't want to just talk at them and give them the union's vision. You want to make sure that they feel like they're being heard. So if you're just another person coming to talk at them, then you're just acting like management, right? You have to actually be open to really, truly, and genuinely listening to folks. And they used to say you should talk 20% of the time and listen 80%. I don't like percentages because like it doesn't work that way in real life oftentimes. I always think like the better rule of thumb is just try to do it more than you talk. If they want to follow a particular line of conversation, follow them there and be natural. And again, you don't want to come across like an organizing robot. Nobody responds to robots. Nobody responds to somebody reading a script off, right? But, you know, there's some points that you're going to have in mind that you're going to try and hit. You'll hit some of them you'll inevitably forget. One of the things that I do after a one-on-one is I actually go over in my head, what could I have said differently? That would have been even more effective. And I usually find at least one thing that I could have done that with. And it just kind of keeps me sharp and on my toes. It's not because you can achieve perfection, you can't, but it just, you know, going back over it kind of helps you think about how you might do it in the future. And then you're going to figure out where they're at and then use their issues to move them. So again, that's the hook, you know, that's how you get people involved. And I always tell people that even if that's not an issue that the union can work on immediately, if they can get enough people worked up about this, if enough people feel this or want to do something about it, then it's an issue that the union can take up. So the question that I had for Clarissa on this one was, well, actually, it's similar to the one we just did about how do you discover issues at your workplace. Maybe instead, I don't think you addressed this previously. If you did, correct me, but what are some common issues that did come up in your workplace? I think that might be helpful to hear too.
Yeah, so I think that a lot of, I would say recently, a lot of the women have been having complaints about kind of sexual harassment from either customers or coworkers, and so that is something that we feel strongly about. Another one is kind of the tier of wages that they give out throughout the year. So we're supposed to get 2 raises a year, but they are very picky, and people don't, they're not suited for the raise, or they didn't, what's the word? Just they didn't fill out all the bubbles for whatever they were supposed to do. So when that time comes around twice a year, there's a lot of animosity with management about, well, what did I do wrong? Why wasn't I notified that I was doing this incorrectly so that I could have fixed it and still earned my raise later? And like I mentioned before, it does come down to kind of favoritism. They don't really I'm sorry, my dog is in the back. What else? I guess scheduling too, kind of, they use, I'm sorry.
Okay, we can go on to the next slide.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Next slide. Assess and agitate. So this is repeating 2 of the things that were in the little formula kind of thing for one-on-ones. So in early stages, you'll likely just be agitating, helping them feel both worked up and heard on an issue, and helping them understand that they aren't alone. Again, connecting it to other people, right? So you're right, that is unfair. They always do that. Jose in produce was talking about the same thing. This is the example I gave earlier. Is there more text on this slide? Eventually, at some stage, if you come to trust them enough, you may ask them if they'd be willing to join your team. And it is important that you trust people enough, because just because somebody's angry doesn't mean they're down. So, and then what have you learned from conversations with other workers? What is the issue that affects the majority and will motivate a majority? A majority of whom? So I think, that this is really getting at the fact that whatever issue you have that motivates you might not be the one that you're actually going to organize around. It might be some other issue, because more people feel that issue. And if you care about getting change in the workplace, being democratic, being effective, then you'll go, a lot of what you go with will be for the majority. It doesn't mean you can't ever organize around things that affect the minority of people. You can, but for the most of the issues, you're going to need a majority to get people to be interested. And especially in terms of organizing a union, you're going to want to have most of the issues be those majority issues. So then the question that I had for Clarissa on this one was 1 or 2 issues that come up the most, which I asked about on the last one, really. I guess how you realized, Clarissa, that those were universal issues.
So I guess, like I said, there's like a buzz around the workplace when, something happens, and some people consider it, like, I guess, gossipy, but it's really just people telling you what they think and how they feel when they're kind of talking in a group, and like they're feeling agitated and they're feeling a type of way about, let's say, like the wage indiscrepancies. It's just, I feel that it does affect everyone, even if they don't really think about it. And it does, you do need to do a lot of one-on-one talking with people to kind of figure out what issue is the most important to them. Like I said, the sexual harassment has been a kind of prominent around this time, and come the January, February, when we're supposed to get our raises and we get our reviews, there's a lot of talk about that and how people have been there for longer, but they're not making as much as the new hires because it's such a more competitive market. So that's something that's been coming up. Also, the no paid sick leave because of the pandemic, that's also been a very big one. And obviously for COVID, we were lucky enough to get some paid time off, but it can be taken away at their discretion. And obviously that doesn't include death of a family member or, any other illness. So that's also something that we've been talking a lot about.
Thank you, Clarissa. And now we're at the 3 or 4 minute mark, so I've got to hurry. Track assessments in your list of workers. This is super important because you have to know who is at what phase. So if they're willing to do something or not. If you don't have the numbers, you can't move forward, because numbers are both power and safety. So you have to have the right amount of numbers to move forward with something. So again, you're going to have to track the assessments and know exactly where people are at, especially in a union election. You need to know who's going to vote yes, because if you lose, you burn that turf for the future for a very long time, potentially. Okay, next slide, please. Assessing potential leaders. Assessing and finding leaders among your coworkers to build your organizing committee. So what are you looking for in a leader? A person who is good at listening and making people feel heard, who doesn't alienate people by being too abrasive, who coworkers feel is trustworthy, and who can lead workers into action. I'd also say somebody who's a hard worker. I think that's a good thing to add there. People don't usually listen to people who they don't think are hard workers. And then what questions should you ask in your organizing conversation to find your potential leaders? Clarissa, very quickly, are there like a couple of questions you can think of that are good for that?
I guess, yeah, you can ask people, you can kind of assign them a task and kind of see how they do, see if they're willing to do it. Me and Dawn in our meetings, we like to talk about assigning certain people to each other, just like, oh, why don't you take care of talking to this person, see where they are, kind of talk to them, see what they think about, the workplace, what their issues are. And that's a good task to kind of have, because you can check in with them and kind of remind them, and if they you can see where they're at in that way. We also kind of, for the socials, we like to ask people to kind of, hey, can you send this mass text? Can you try to ask these people that you don't normally talk to and see if they are willing to come, kind of introduce yourself. And these are good, these are good ways to kind of get people to feel like, oh, I feel included, and I'm also and it's extremely helpful to have people kind of take on the role of basically anything during organizing. And there's different, oh, sorry, just one more thing. There's different roles for different people. There are some people who won't really go out to the socials, but they work hard behind the scenes, kind of working, sending out emails, updating our list of people in the workplace. So, there's always, for all types of personalities, there's always something for someone to do.
Thank you, Clarissa. Next slide, please. Where to talk? You are allowed to talk on the job. According to NLRA Section 7, all workers have the right to protected concerted activity, including talking to their coworkers about their wages and working conditions. That being said, talking in the workplace gets overheard. Be strategic. By the way, protected concerted activity just means, just talking to people about working conditions or taking an action on those working conditions. Both of those things are considered protected concerted activity. Talking outside of work. People only want to meet outside of work if they feel needed or think it will be fun. So give them like Chris was talking about, they need a task, right? They need to feel needed and important. And you do need them. It's not just like, it's not trying to trick them, right? You need more people involved so that you can reach more people and spread the work, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, next slide then, since we're at time. Core concepts: socialize before you organize. Organizing is all about listening. I wouldn't say all, I'd say a lot. And find out what your coworkers care about and make individual problems collective.